Welcome to the Ultimate Lifespan Podcast with Buck Risby, bringing you the latest in evidence-based but often controversial approaches to natural health and wellness with less stress. Plus, healthy advances for slipping into your ideal weight while looking and feeling younger than your years. Sprinkled with surprising stories, expert interviews, and plenty of irreverence for the status quo. If you're ready to take charge of your health and finally feel in control, buckle up and enjoy this next episode of Ultimate Lifespan.
Hey there, folks. Buck Risby here. Another episode of the Ultimate Lifespan Podcast. Today's episode, Adult Homeschool, removing the harness that's hurting your health and relationships. The story starts with my son's physical getting ready for public school this year. My wife took him to a medical center that was still conducting physicals, not far from here, maybe 30 minutes or so. And they both did, with a doctor. And as they were chatting, my wife mentioned that she's in the natural health space. They were talking about current events and what they're planning to do when they open up schools this year, given that we're still in the middle of a pandemic. The doctor mentioned that her kids, the school system that her kids are a part of, and she's in a different county than us, they were notified, or she was notified, that they're going to allow distance learning, and that's fine. But one of the aspects of that distance learning that they're instilling or requiring is that the kids spend a certain number of hours in front of the screen. And they're somehow going to verify that that's happening. I went and looked, and apparently in the state of Colorado, the public school systems are required to deliver 1,080 instructional hours. That's teacher-pupil instruction every year, 1,080 hours. And it sounds like what they're doing is they're going to force the kids, come hell or high water, to get that 1,080 hours of teacher-pupil instruction, even if it means forcing them to sit in front of a screen a certain amount of time, which sounds really weird to me, especially given that, it's hard for kids to hold still. I guess that if they're in a physical school environment, it's easier to have them sit at their desks and pay attention. But when they're in front of a screen, that's going to be more difficult to achieve. And it reminds me of a similar experience, but different, that I had when I was learning to become an instrument-rated pilot. In flying, they do require you to have a certain number of hours of flying time with an instructor. And that makes sense because you're going to be going through a number of procedures. You're going to be landing in different scenarios. And the amount of time that you spend doing that helps to reinforce these muscle memory, dealing with turbulence, making the final approach to landing, etc., and handling emergency procedures. So I definitely get it when it comes to something like learning how to fly and having a mandatory number of hours that you're in the plane with an instructor going through instruction. I have another story when it comes to when I work with virtual assistants, for example. And I have a number of virtual assistants that I work with. Some are in the U.S., some are not in the U.S. And there are a couple schools of thought when it comes to working with a remote resource. One school of thought with virtual assistants is that you could have them clock in at a certain time. You can ask them to record, and in fact, there are platforms for virtual assistants where they will record what is on the assistant's screen while they're working and making sure that they work, that you have the ability to literally look over their shoulder and make sure that they're doing the job. So not only a time clock, but also a screen capture of what they're doing. And I find that is not, for me personally, has not been the most productive way or has not been the best way to get the best productivity from a remote worker. There's an interesting book by Liz Wiseman called Multipliers, How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. And Liz mentions that there are two types, based on the studies that she's performed, there are two types of leaders. I know, everything comes down to two types, right? She calls them diminishers versus multipliers. And I'm going to open this by saying that, and this is probably a quote from her, if employees feel pressured to keep their nose to the grindstone, and you could substitute students of any type, employees, for this phrase, if they feel pressure to keep their nose to the grindstone, they're too busy working harder to step back and contemplate how they can work smarter. So that's a very eye-opening statement. Diminishers, what do they have in common? I'm talking about leaders that are diminishers. Well, they think others can't figure out things on their own. They need help. They tend to micromanage, and I kind of cringe when I hear this because I might fall into the diminisher category. They tend to micromanage. They pressure their underlings to perform faster. And if they don't like what's going on, they'll tend to jump in and make decisions for them, right? They're not allowing autonomy of their subordinates. And subordinates here could be substituted for whether it's employees, whether it's your kids, whether it's, a virtual assistant, that sort of thing. Multipliers they tend to give much more space for their subordinates to think, find answers for themselves, and to operate independently. That's a big deal. And that leads to freedom, the freedom to not only be more effective at what you do, but to socialize, to collaborate, which can lead to aha moments for your staff, for your kids, many times for yourself, to rest and to experiment. And sometimes serendipitous things happen when you're able to experiment. So that leads me to a revelation, maybe for myself, for you. When might you be a diminisher? Well, if you tend to, and these are some behaviors that occur with diminishers, if you tend to dominate meetings with your enthusiasm or ideas, I know that sounds great, but that can be diminishing for people that you are around. If you need to be constantly in the loop, so it's kind of you're letting people know that you don't necessarily trust them, then you might be a diminisher. You might be a diminisher if you like to jump in and rescue people or projects, and you do that all the time. I'm like slapping my own wrist because I tend to do that. You might be a diminisher. You might be a diminisher if you feel slighted when people question you or your recommendations, right? As I get older, I tend to want to listen to what people have to say, listen to other people's opinions, and be willing to be wrong. I'm not always like that, but I'm better at it now that I'm older. When might you be a multiplier? Well, you ask questions and you wait. This is the big one. You wait for the answers and you listen to them. You think about, and I do this with my assistants, with people that assist me and that are remote workers for me. I tend to do this where I give them an objective. It's the what, not the how. I give the person the objective and I allow them to figure it out, which leads to the next, reason why you might be a multiplier. You show them how you trust them, right? Show that you trust them, which then leads to instilling confidence in those folks because they feel they can get things done on their own. They figured it out, which leads to my sort of connection back to the first thing that I mentioned, which was, do we really need to be in the seat for 1,080 hours of instruction each year? I'm talking about public school here, which shifts the focus from time-based focus to results-based focus. I'm a big fan of getting results, and I think you probably are too, right? You want to see the end result. And with kids, the end result is we want them to have the knowledge, certainly. We want them to be well socialized, and we want them to be productive members of society, right? And be able to take care of themselves. That's a big deal. That's our job as parents. The alternative to all this is if we subject ourselves or if our kids are subjected to the stress of being told what to do, to have to sit in their seat for 1,080 hours a year, it creates an environment of chronic stress. And scientific studies have shown that chronic stress reduces performance. I don't need a study to tell me that chronic stress reduces performance because I've been in those situations as an employee where I've been around very stressful, I would call them diminisher type leaders. And I was stressed, I felt anxious, and I was not able to perform at my highest level of productivity. This is a very interesting time that we're in right now, we have, because of the current pandemic, we have the ability now to negotiate a better working environment. I was just chatting with a neighbor, and he's actually a remote worker. He works for a company that's actually based in India, believe it or not, but he's here in the United States. He's an American. And he mentioned that CFOs of companies around the country are really very excited about what some of the things that have been happening, because they are able now to cut leases on properties that are empty. Travel and living expenses are way down because people are not jumping into airplanes. They're not getting into face-to-face meetings. Everyone is switched to Zoom calls and video conferencing. And more people, really working from home is no longer the exception. I've been working from a home office for now 15 years. And I felt like, I was the exception. Now I've become the rule, where working from home is now the norm. And now I think we are not going back. I think employees, people in the workspace, they have had that taste. The cow has left the barn, right? She's not coming back in. So we want to take advantage of this opportunity. And the same thing goes for public school system, it goes for our personal lives. We want to take advantage of the fact that we have more time, we can be more productive, and we can be happier. And this leads to the main point of this whole conversation, which is how can we have better health and relationships as a result of this, I'm calling it adult homeschool environment that we're in. Well, I was posed with a question on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook a lot, but I saw this question and it came up. The question was, would you rather have $200 more a month or a week, maybe it's $200 a week versus 2 more hours a week of time? For me, I personally would want the time. If I could get more time back, I can make a lot more than $200, right? I would figure out how to take advantage of that time, because time is the one thing we can't necessarily buy, right? It's a very precious resource and we always want to protect it. A lot of people, maybe they're under a lot more pressure and strain and they said, I want the $200 a week. I could use the $200. But I think the time is certainly more valuable. With time, you can spend it with your family, your loved ones. I just sat and had a cup of coffee with my wife. I do that every morning. You can take that time and plan what you're going to do today and in the future. You can make plans. And you can invest that time in yourself. That includes your ability to read and educate yourself, to exercise, get more fit, and maybe have the time to eat well and socialize. Those are things that are very, very valuable that you want to take advantage of. So I'm going to wrap it up by saying that, yes, we're in a stressful, high anxiety environment with what's happening with the current pandemic, but a lot of things have happened that we can take advantage of to get better control of our time, have better control of the time of our children, if we do have children in school, and effectively put ourselves into adult homeschool for better health and relationships. This is Buck Risby. I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.
Thanks for joining us today on Ultimate Lifespan. Head on over to ultimatelyfespan.com for full recaps of every show, our controversial but educational blog articles, and to take our ever-popular 30-second health assessment quiz. See you at ultimatelyfespan.com.